Welcome, everybody. Oh, gonna figure this mic out. Okay, as we're getting started, I'm gonna do a little bit of a plug. I'm Andrea with Inkbuilt. I'll do an introduction here in just a second, but we have some cards out on the table. We have a booth downstairs where we're just wanting to hear people come together and share their big ideas and share their wins. So if there's something your team has accomplished this year that you're proud of, it's something you accomplished this year that you're proud of, maybe it was last year, we want to be able to celebrate that with you. So if you take a second, either now or by the end, if you want to fill out one of the cards, we'll go post them downstairs. But we just want to share all of the great work that everybody's doing, because bringing affordable housing to market is a full collaborative effort. And we want to acknowledge that. And we know that these ideas that really make it happen come from everywhere. So that's a little plug. I'm going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. As I mentioned, my name is Andrea Wallace. I'm a principal architect with Inkbuilt Architecture. And I'm proud to say we're a woman-owned architecture firm based in Portland. We're a fairly small firm, but I consider us pretty mighty. We've been able to do quite a bit of work, and something we're really proud of is the work that we've been able to do with CDP on this project, Timber Ridge, that we're going to be talking about today. Our format is going to be roughly a 10-minute quick presentation that I'm going to give you kind of a high-level view of the project. And I'm going to leave some of the nuts and bolts for the panel discussion that's going to follow. So I apologize in advance if it feels like I'm kind of skimming over some stuff that you're like, oh, I wish they got into the meat of that. We're going to hopefully get to that during the panel. And if we don't, we're going to leave enough time for the Q&A session. So please feel free to ask us questions when we get to the end. Okay. I also want to start off with a land acknowledgement today. And while land acknowledgements are intended to be respectful, we understand that they oversimplify really complex histories and fail to recognize the historic and ongoing injustices and impacts of colonialization that tribal communities continue to live with to this day. So while we respectfully acknowledge that what is now known as LaGrande, Oregon is the ancestral land and unceded territory of the Umatilla, Sayus, Yakima, and Walla Walla people, we want to take this time both for acknowledgement, but also to encourage ourselves and all of you here in this room to actually take action. So we've listed some action items that were actually developed by the Eco Trust. We've kind of spin on those a little bit, but it's really important that we kind of stop talking about just acknowledgement. While that's an important piece of it, we also need to all be taking action. So things like giving land back, protecting our natural resources and our first foods, electing officials that actually know tribal governances, making sure that we're keeping this type of education in our schools for our children to learn from is really important. So, and we will provide slides at the end of this presentation to Housing Oregon to distribute. Okay. So as I mentioned, the project that we're going to be talking about is Timber Ridge Apartments. This project is has become an 82-unit project. We'll get into that a little bit. Its estimated completion is next month. It's a net zero project that's also got some really ambitious goals, targeting LEED Platinum. It was part of the ILFI Affordable Housing Pilot Program, and it had quite a few lenses that were applied to it. As we get into that, it's important to note kind of where the project is located. So LaGrande is in rural northeastern Oregon, in Union County. And Union County, or LaGrande itself, makes up about half the population of that county. It's a pretty big city for that county. And it's got a pretty high poverty rate compared to like state of Oregon. So the need for affordable housing is more so in this area, but also in LaGrande itself. And LaGrande has some complex issues with just the fact that you've got some major highways that kind of disconnect it and kind of cut it in quarters, but also that a lot of the affordable housing is being is in competition with the local university. So a lot of student housing, affordable housing kind of goes to the students. And so there's some competition there. According to the 2019 ACS data, at the home market in LaGrande had a vacancy rate of like 10.4%. So it's actually significantly lower than the statewide rate of about 4% at the time. But as I mentioned, it has these other kind of issues with being able to provide housing in LaGrande. So the LaGrande itself, as I mentioned, is kind of cut into quarters with the highways there. The project site is kind of on a more disconnected quarter, and it has really limited transportation and walkability in that area. So you can kind of see within the 10-minute walk, there's literally nothing. As you get into the 20-minute walk, you got a Walmart and a couple of market like mini marts and gas stations. But there's really just not even enough that's really walkable. So everything is going to be really relied on. We knew from the very beginning of this project that it was going to really be vehicular dominated. LeGrand is this really beautiful town. If you haven't been there, I encourage you all to go. The downtown area is super walkable. It's kind of along the railroad there. Up north is Pioneer Park. You got the Grand Ronde River. You got Mount Emily. You've got a ton of kayaking, hiking, mountain biking, you name it. There's plenty to do in LeGrand. If you're into kind of hauntedness, you can go out to like the Hot Lake Lodge. It's pretty fun. It's beautiful soaking pools with this kind of eerie hotel, but it's fantastic. So there's a lot of things that are, you know, really beautiful about LeGrand, and it's this really kind of great community out there. But as I mentioned, this site being kind of across the highway feels a bit disconnected. The site itself is located kind of surrounded by a handful of mobile home parks. So there's like 3 or 4 mobile home parks that kind of situate themselves all around it. And then outside of that, it's got a rural, quite a bit of rural farmland. There's a Coca-Cola bottling facility kind of right across the street. And then, as I mentioned, it's kind of disconnected by the highways. So it was really important to us to bring as much onto that site as possible. We're going to be talking about what some of those elements are here, especially as we get into the panel discussion. But the other thing that the site has is that because it's pretty low density, it's got this beautiful kind of 360 panoramic views of the mountains all around. And that really is what helped inspire the project to kind of draw off those mountains. And then really early on, actually, and Dan's in the room, so I'm going to plug him a little bit, but he brought these really kind of great organizations to the table. And it was anywhere from like veteran support organizations to maybe individuals fleeing abusive situations, children aging out of foster care. He brought everybody to the table and kind of said, what are your needs? And do you have needs here in LeGrand? And how can we support you? And how can we make sure that you have space on this project? So from the onset, we knew that we needed to look at this project a little bit differently. And we really adopted a trauma-informed lens early on. So that way we could make sure that as these different groups of populations that have much different traumas, much different needs could kind of all be met in one space. So I know Nate's going to talk about that from a design perspective as we get into the presentation, but that was something really early on. So as we got into the site design, we had kind of started with the top images with these kind of double loaded corridors. And then after having this conversation, it was like, well, wait a second, like, how can we make this building more safe? How can we make sure that a woman coming home is going to feel safe getting from her car to her front door? Well, she needs eyes on it, right? So we started to design the building with a single loaded corridor. And now you have eyes on the street. You can see your car from your unit. You can also see all the beautiful community space behind the buildings. And we really wanted to make it feel kind of organic. We wanted people to feel like they could come onto the site and it's not just this big parking lot, right? So it's got like some movement to it. It's got a lot of connections, and there's a lot of kind of visual connections throughout the site that kind of make that all happen. We also played with color. I'll get into that in just a second. But when we first designed the site, it was actually a little bit bigger. It was going to be 102 units. And as we started getting ready to close, I think it was right before closing probably, COVID hit and did to our project what it did to all of yours, I'm sure. And so things had to be kind of very quickly thought through and figured out in a way to be able to make this project still happen. And it really couldn't have happened without the work that CDP did to secure for more funding and get more resources at the table. And it was very complex. But one of the moves that we did was also to reduce the number of units. But we wanted to do that in a way that really meant we could still get all of the community features that we're going to highlight, that we weren't going to take a hit on durability. We weren't going to get rid of this net zero kind of energy efficiency goals. That was all still very much at stake and on the table. And so we had to figure out a way to do that differently. And that was through removing a couple of buildings on site. But what it did was open up the site. So it opened it up a little bit. We got actually more community features, which was really important because, as I mentioned, we're super disconnected from the rest of the city. There's no parks nearby. So when we can kind of add more park-like features to the site, in my opinion, as much as I'd love to provide more units, I actually think it turned out better because it really gave more assets to the people that are going to be living on site as well as the surrounding neighborhoods. So earlier I mentioned the kind of blue mountains that surround LeGrand and these panoramic views of the mountains, and they're gorgeous. And so we drew a lot of inspiration early on from the kind of mountain ridges, Timber Ridge, and then the big timber trees. So the design really did that. And we wanted to break down the mass of the building so that way it's kind of at a really intimate, more personal scale. They're 3-story buildings. I didn't mention this, but I think it was an R3 zoning with like a 35-foot height limit. And so they're pretty small scale buildings. We're not talking anything with elevators, everything's walk up. But we wanted to kind of break up that scale, put some big timber beams out front, big timber columns out front, and then play with the folds of the building to also really allow us to increase the amount of solar exposure we could have on the roofs, which helped get us to net zero. Another important feature was the kind of investigation and kind of play with color. A lot of buildings have one color or two colors, and we really wanted this space to be vibrant, and we wanted this space to draw on all of the different colors that different cultural kind of identities have, and to be able to all those different meanings like can kind of come together. And from a trauma-informed lens, we kind of played with really bright wayfinding colors on the exterior of the building, but then we muted that on the interior, and Nate will show you some slides on that as well. But what that did is it creates these little pops of color that happen throughout the buildings, and then these big anchor points at the corners. And so it kind of creates this vibrancy on the site. You know, a lot of times LeGrand gets a lot more sun than we do here in Portland, but those gray sky days just turn so much more bright when there's a lot of color on site. So we're really excited about the way that turned out. And then those colorful facades and those pops of color culminate at a community event building, like at the center heart of the site. And those got painted last week. We're very excited. We worked with a Portland-based painter, Jesslyn Brinkerhoff. Her and her brother came out and painted these in about 2 weeks. And they're these beautiful swirls of color that bring the colors of the buildings together with the big timbers and trees in the foreground on the exterior. And then the interior has got this really beautiful swirling color to kind of tie everything together. That community building also has a Head Start space, so there's daycare on site, which we're really excited about, and we'll talk a little bit more how that came to be. But we're pretty excited about where the design was able to go, where the inspiration kind of came from, and actually being able to see something that we dreamt up coming to life. So this is Timber Ridge, and we're going to get into a panel discussion here. Hopefully I didn't start my timer, so hopefully I'm okay on time so far. Okay. One thing I should mention, today we don't have Sarah Parker. She's the executive director for the Northeast Oregon Housing Authority. She is this brilliant woman who has this deep rooted passion for LeGrand and really helped us kind of keep everything in check along the way, especially as those really hard conversations were happening, and remembering why it was so important to keep them and really keeping the tenants and the people that are going to be living here at the focus of everything that we were doing. So we're super sad that she wasn't able to join us. But I do have a couple of things that she kind of offered up to us to kind of answer for her as we get through the panel discussion. So I'll be speaking on her behalf a little bit, but I also am providing her contact information at the end of the presentation. And I please encourage you to reach out to her, ask her questions. She's fantastic to work with. But yeah, James, I'll go ahead and start with you. James is a project manager for Community Development Partners. If you want to go ahead and just give us a quick introduction, and then it would be good to kind of highlight, well, it's good to highlight that you kind of came into this project partway through and kind of understand what some of your first impressions were.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I want to acknowledge that we are 3 Portland professionals presenting on a rural project. So again, as Andrea mentioned, it's unfortunate, but we'll do the best that we can. And yeah, so I'm James Lee, project manager for Community Development Partners. We're a statewide affordable housing developer and long-term owner. However, for Timber Ridge, we were the developer and in support of Northeast Oregon Housing Authority as the owner. And I was handed the reins of this project from really a living legend in affordable housing development, Mr. Dan Steffi, who has joined us today. And so really my job was to not screw it up. That was goal one. And I think that was a little bit tougher than either of us had anticipated. The pandemic, as Andrea mentioned, was in full swing. Challenges around, costs, labor shortages, supply chain. We were looking at about a $10 million gap in a $26 million project. And we decided to add federal funding a little bit later in the project, which is its own fun process. So, and despite all of that, I joined the project, and my first question was, "Where's LeGrand?" I'm a little embarrassed by that, honestly, but I really think it spoke to coming from Portland, working with a rural housing authority, that we were really starting from the ground floor. Dan had built a really great relationship, but I was coming in from the ground floor and really tried to emphasize, or we really took it seriously, getting to know the community and the folks that live there and would eventually live in our project. So I hope some of that comes through today in our discussion.
Yeah, and I think that also helped maybe because it allowed you to really have your ears and mind totally open and like take the advice of Sarah and her team that had their boots on the ground. So that was something that I think we all really took very seriously. Nate, you and I came into this project given very little context about what it wanted to be. And at the very beginning, there weren't a whole lot of set project goals. Those kind of developed over time. What are some of the most important moments, goals, and decisions that kind of emerged through that?
Yeah, it was quite an interesting process. I mean, Eric from CDP, the executive director there, kind of took a leap of faith with our little firm, and we didn't have much to go on other than like, oh, it should be a really beautiful kind of lushly landscaped site. Here's a couple of pieces of information, and things just kind of unfolded slowly from there in this kind of organic way. And that actually turned out to be one of I think the best aspects of this project, and the way that it kind of came to being a just and equitable and inclusive community was not as a like, hey, we have these goals and we're using these terminologies and we're talking about trauma-informed design. It was much more, what does this community need? And how does, we just got to do a lot of listening with the community groups that Andrea mentioned. Dan was really great at just kind of throwing out some what if questions, like what if we could do this? And our job, we just saw our job as, let's figure out how to make that work, and how to integrate that. And so that really, as we listened to the community's desires for safety and supportive space, we knew, okay, this needs to be kind of trauma informed. It needs to meet these folks that have specific needs and backgrounds. Sarah came into the project and really just advocated from her heart for the people that were going to live there and what they were going to need long term. Like Andrea was saying, like thinking about, all the sort of like urban design stuff that gets put in our head is different when you hear from a local person who's like, well, when it's snowing and the mom has to leave her kid in the car to take the groceries upstairs and then come back, like, don't put the parking way over there, and do this like pedestrian thing. So we're like, okay, well, how do we still make really great design out of that? And that turned out to just be like the wonderful challenges of it, to make it intergenerational. Net zero came into the project kind of midstream, and we'll get into that a little bit more too. And it's like, it just took a lot of an adaptive kind of approach, and it helped that we knew a little bit of LeGrand. I've had the opportunity in the past to, I forgot to do my background. I'll get to that right at the end. Sorry. But this kind of leads into it because I came from Idaho and moved out here back in 2004. But I had a bit of a rural. I'm kind of a hickster, if you will. Had a rural background a little bit, and got to also work on some Eastern Oregon University projects in the past. So just really knowing that it's a beautiful place, and then to have Sarah, whose eyes light up when she talks about going out in the mountains and going snowmobiling, and just knowing her area really well, was like, okay, we just kind of got into the spirit of the project, and I think that was that was just kind of what was so rewarding about it. But I'm also one of the principal architects at Inkbuilt. Let's see. I don't know what else matters now.
I think that's good. Yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and kind of get into some of the questions now. Getting affordable housing projects on the ground has never been easy. And it's often more difficult to fund and implement in rural communities, even though, as already mentioned, the need is truly significant. So what is an asset-based approach to development, and why was it so important to this project?
Yeah, so CDP started working with Portland State University's Center for Public Interest Design about 6 or 7 years ago on what they called their asset-based community development model. And the way that I've looked at that, I think CDP approaches it is that, we're developing projects in places where we don't necessarily live, Astoria, LeGrand, Salem, Rockwood. I'm from 142nd in Fremont in Northeast Portland, and I believe Rockwood starts at 162nd in Stark. And I grew up knowing very little about Rockwood. And so a lot of these things are very hyper local. So having an organization like CPID come in and help us navigate the asset-based community development process, ABCD process, with our local partners like Northeast Oregon Housing Authority, or in the case of Rockwood, Hacienda CDC, allows us to really try and integrate these projects into the fabric of the community. CPID has a pretty robust definition of what asset-based community development is, but for me, it meant instead of taking more of a top-down approach where we go into a community with our bundle of goods and services and say, here you go, you're welcome. It's really going in with more of a grassroots, ground up approach, and looking at doing outreach through working groups and surveys, and actually physically surveying, walking through the community and seeing what assets are available, and how the community can be involved in the project. One example that I really like from CDP, it's not a project that I was involved in, but it was in Rockwood, and the site was historically landlocked, but it was used as a park for residents. And I don't think that, going in there, we knew that. And you really had to be local or a longtime resident to understand the significance and the historical use on the site. But when we were able to gain that insight, we really literally built the project around the idea of creating a publicly accessible but privately funded park there in Rockwood that sort of stitched together some other greenways across the city. And that's something that I think we're really proud of. And we took that same approach to Timber Ridge. And I showed up in Timber Ridge, and I thought that maybe there would be a lack of resources and service providers compared to what I'm used to seeing in my community of Portland. But going through the process, we were able to put together a working group of over a dozen organizations, community-based organizations that dealt with domestic violence, healthcare, health education and promotion, economic development. And those partners really helped shape the project in a meaningful way. They, before shovels hit dirt, they were writing letters of recommendation and MOUs. Some ended up being grant funders for the project that helped us include elements that wouldn't have otherwise made it into the project. And they also directly contributed to the project and offering services on site and being part of design discussions for the community center and what assets we provided on the ground. So it was a great model for us to bring the community into the project.
Right into, right? And there's our slides. I can probably still keep speaking to this one while we're waiting. Okay. Yeah, there's some of those great organizations that were on the working group James mentioned. Yeah, so in the same way, I think that's what we that process that James just described really kind of unfolded again a little bit slower in a way. Like it wasn't kind of just put on the table, but as we came to know it, we really appreciated it and came to see, even as Andrea said, and as Sarah frequently reminded us, the site is a long way from everything. So it needs to make the most of everything, and it needs to provide for the neighborhood around it, needs to give people plenty to do, make sure they're well supported. So even though in that way, there weren't like kind of what we think of as like walkable services and close things kind of already in existence, there was this great network of supporting agencies. There's a, fantastic nature all around that's so easy to get to. So these assets really did inspire us kind of all the way through. And so it really just took us kind of adapting to the approach, letting it evolve. We even had to design the community building to get a pricing set out, and then some of this kind of community outreach engagement stuff happened a little bit later, and we were able to kind of go back, and we found creative ways like, oh, we have another round of kind of pricing refinement and VE, so let's work in these ideas and make sure that everything is kind of absorbing the best community feedback that we can get. So it, just kind of making that work and making sure that those things are woven in. Let's see. Yeah, and I think just coming back to that idea of just finding ways to say yes to how do we meet a need, and then how do we find a solution that meets more than one, right? Because we know we're limited on cost and all those things.
Absolutely. So it sounds like kind of a rich soil has been being prepared by applying this type of thought to what the project could do and what it could be. Through this inventory of local assets, along with partnerships across the community, what issues, needs, and opportunities did you discover, and how did you find ways to meet them? I'm going to go ahead and plug in kind of what Sarah was going to say to this. So I'm speaking on behalf of Sarah here. It's a little bit weird to be like moderating and then answering my own question. The Housing Authority knew from the very get-go that there was a huge waiting list of just people needing to get into housing. And from our social services folks, we knew that the demographics, the experiences, and the needs of these folks was very diverse. They had worked with partners like Shelter from the Storm, for example, to make sure that women fleeing domestic violence would have a path into safe, affordable housing, and knew that there'd be seniors, kids, aging out of foster care, as I kind of mentioned previously, and lots of folks that need all need this type of housing. And as we've already kind of covered, there was this really great fabric of supportive services that's already in LeGrand. There are already boots on the ground. They just have nowhere to put people that really need housing. And so this project was really important to make sure that we could make that happen. And there was a real need for these kind of like park-like spaces. And we wanted to kind of put those throughout the site wherever we could, and even a space for like a community garden, because we wanted to make sure it was as livable as possible. And we wanted to be able to bring in people from these surrounding neighborhoods onto the site and open up the site to provide that kind of park resource that, as James and Nate kind of mentioned, just wasn't there. And you're hearing the need from the community. Head Start is also a great asset in LeGrand, and to have them on site is a fantastic opportunity to help families support their little ones and start a good life right out of the gate. And I'll pass it over to James.
Yeah, so as Neoha helped us understand more about who the future tenants would be, who was on the waiting list, who lived in their other projects, who community members were, we started to form the idea of what we called an intentionally intergenerational community. At Community Development Partners, we've come up with a research-based program or lens, really, that we call Community for All Ages, or CFAA. And these are intentionally planned housing communities that foster intergenerational connection through design and services, where people of all ages can live, work, play, and thrive. So you can see there on the slide we have the CFAA values, and while Timber Ridge doesn't include a standalone community build or a senior building, it really does include almost all, if not all, of the other key elements. We talked about the asset-based community development model, multidisciplinary team of professionals, family housing and senior housing together, inclusive design, wide mix of unit types. We have 1 to 4 bedrooms. We have townhome units. Accessibility is a driving factor. Inclusive design. I said that one. Sustainable meeting. Just a lot of these programs. Intergenerational programming was a big part of it as well. So, and this became really important as we've mentioned this project experienced financial challenges. And when that happens, you have hard decisions and you have competing priorities, and you have to figure out what's more important in a world where everything's important. So having this lens to come back to, this intentionally intergenerational CFAA lens as we were evaluating and trying to make decisions was really important. I think we did a good job as a team to use this model to come back to and inform some of the design decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So as these needs kind of and opportunities emerged, we just knew the project had to be trauma informed, but it really needed to reflect the experiences and values of a broad cross section of people. So Andrea did a really great job already of kind of talking about how our site design was influenced by those ideas and thinking about safety and thinking about access. And another piece of that Sarah talked to a lot was, not knowing people coming from different places. People don't always want to be forced to mingle or be communal, right? And so having the ability to have a little bit of space from each other, not have these like kind of central little stairways and tight hallways was a big deal. So we were able to kind of create these larger porches and spaces where people were going to be able to spill out, face each other, face the buildings, and kind of create sort of a courtyard type of feel, but never be too, have to be too crowded in. And so that kind of opening up and spaciousness also kind of ended up working really well with creating pathways throughout the site and through the nature. So you really could kind of have an experience of moving through the site to the different amenity spaces, and always have these kind of warm social porches that you'll see in some of the views later on. And so that really was part of figuring out how to, how do we fit in the parking? How do we do all the practical things that we have to do? While weaving in this trauma-informed lens, an intergenerational lens from the very typology that we choose, because so often these things are kind of put in at the back of like, oh, it's a different color or a warmer material, but I think in our view, it's much more fundamental than that. And then, speaking to, I think some of those amenities that, having a central sort of playground and park space that with lots of eyes on it, and weaving in places for, we have these pads that have, can do those outdoor exercise equipment, and, or just, giving people an opportunity for fitness that isn't just like some machines in a room, right? And for that kind of health experience, and figuring out how, and people are going to have dogs and pets, and the dog park was kind of an in and out feature that was like, this would be really nice to have. We don't know if we can make it happen. And then when we had to open up the site a little bit more, we were able to get that back in. And pickleball was something that has become just coveted. The whole neighborhood around it is like, when is this project going to be done? When's the pickleball ready? So it's just kind of like you see the community building happening, just at that scale by giving people something to get excited about. So this is the community building. Originally, when it was even larger than this, but we ended up, it's over 4,000 square feet, and really we're able to get, kind of a meeting space / kind of classroom space, the Head Start space that Andrea talked about, which has an outdoor kind of secure playground as well. And then a really large community event space. We wanted to make that kind of as big as we could, because, thinking about winter months and snow on the ground, and just hearing Sarah's voice of like, people need something to do, people need a place to go. So like, a kid needs to have a room or a place to run around in or whatever, and people need to be able to have a gathering and a wedding event, and then maybe they don't have much money to go rent a place, right? Or whatever. So like just being able to make that be as generous and flexible a space as possible. It's set up to be able to do cooking classes, and there's like a study space because mid-pandemic we're like, oh, people need as much of that kind of out of their house space as they can get. So even as things had to be downsized, we really fought to keep all of those pieces intact and working together. This is some of the stuff that the outreach, the PSU CPID team helped put together in their report as they were talking to the community and bringing their own ideas to the table. And then, this is the community building kind of where it stands today. It's getting very close to completion. We got that mural on the front, and we're just really excited to see this come together. This is some of the design, interior design with some of those trauma-informed material palettes, biophilia that we were thinking about too, getting people close to warm materials and soft colors and great daylight are all still really woven into that trauma-informed kind of stance, along with the art and color that help make that space what it is. And then just thinking about, again, that how you move through the site, how you experience it, looking out your windows, being able to see what it feels like to look at the other buildings, not just as something right next to you staring in, but how to, these kind of sidewalks and nature spaces that weave throughout. Here's some of that kind of nature play getting installed, and kind of creating a courtyard between buildings, and something really, again, that's beautiful to look at. And then here's some of those social porches that weave in, the timber aesthetic, they give this kind of a substantial feel, right? Not just boxes for people to live in, but it creates this kind of sense of presence, places for people to hang out, to put a little table and chairs, to meet people if they want to. Here's kind of along the street edge, seeing some of that kind of landscape space. We used stormwater, little swales. We were able to use a local civil engineer and kind of work with the climate and weave in little dry creek beds and swales that become features for the site. And I think Andrea kind of spoke to color and some of that as well, and how that really works together. So we just tried to kind of really create beauty in the experience of the site as much as we could.
Okay, so as we mentioned, we've got a lot of different populations being supported in this housing, each with different issues and specific needs, and without the inherent diversity of supporting resources found in more urban environments. That's a lot to balance and address already. And then the team decided to cover the cost of utilities in order to further reduce cost burden for residents. How did that come about? And how did you make it work financially? We all want to know.
Yeah, we'll see if it works financially. I think the jury's still out. We're just now getting up and operational. We turned on the solar and net metering for phase 1. We've started leasing up the first project. So I think we're feeling really good, but we're going to see what happens. But sustainability is critical. We heard a little bit at lunch about, where we're at, and CDP really believes that. So we have our own goals around sustainability, typically above code minimum, in excess of the funding requirements. So early on, we identified Timber Ridge as an all electric project. And then you start to look at the climate in LeGrand, over 200 days of sun, solar pretty quickly became a part of the conversation. But there's one factor in particular that really started to push us in the direction of owner-paid utilities. And that really had to do with high base charges, or what I call door fees. So as many of you know, our electrical bills are split into 2 main parts: the variable electric charge with the cost of the unit per energy and how many units you use per month. And that's pretty similar between like a market like Portland and then what we found in LeGrand. And then there's the base charge, which is the fixed fees, which is really the cost, what it costs the utility to get that electricity to your door, their rent, their mortgage, the infrastructure. And in a place like Portland, or Pacific Core can spread that over a lot of different households, where some of these smaller utilities like Oregon Trail Electric Co-op, which we worked with, and which was incredible, they just have fewer folks to spread that cost around, so the costs are typically higher. For example, last I checked, Pacific Core's base charge is like $8 a month, and in LeGrand it was over $33 a month. So, and the way that utility allowances are structured, those reductions, that equates 1-to-1 to a reduction in rent, and that reduces the permanent debt that the project can support, which directly takes money away from the project and the amenities that we can provide. So we really wanted to take a look at what we could do to keep that money going towards the project. And you can see some of the impact, when we took the base charge and as we started to look, if the owner is going to pay for the utilities, well, how do we make it so we can pay as little as possible, so we still have that operating income that can support the project? So we took a lot of that into account, and I won't get too much into the numbers, but originally we looked at like a 10-year payoff, under 10 years, and that doesn't include the additional perm debt. It doesn't include additional incentives, and that felt pretty good. But with the improvements in the Inflation Reduction Act, we were able to get that down to what we believe will be under 7. And then the project will really be, the solar portion will be paid off, and you won't have an electric bill, which is pretty exciting. Let's see if I have anything else on this one. Yeah, but it wasn't just about the money. LeGrand has high temperature variability, so high highs and low lows, and sometimes that's on the same day. So tenant bills can be pretty variable. And going back to the intentionally intergenerational lens, the CFAA, it was really important that we stabilize tenants as much as possible. So taking that seasonal variability out of the equation for tenants, so they knew what their rent would be every month, we felt would be a really great way to help support tenants and stability, which was an important goal for us.
Yeah, awesome. And to build on that, I think once we were like, oh wow, this whole solar system is feasible, we're like, yeah, this needs to be a net zero project. How do we make sure that we do the rest of that cost effectively? But just it's pretty exciting to see that it's going to be a net positive cash flow after 7 years, just that alone, and how we know that the long-term maintenance budgets and all the things that the housing authority is going to face, just having a little bit of that to look forward to and hopefully be helpful is pretty awesome. Yeah, so we did. We worked with Fleet, who had tons of knowledge on implementing the solar and working with all the weird nuances of the utility, like 25 kilowatt per meter limitations. That kind of dictated our whole electrical layout. So, but it was really great having that expertise. And so we were able to bring our knowledge on kind of what's cost effective as a way to reduce energy loads and make sure that we get to that net zero. And as James was saying, this is a climate that can be quite cold and hot. And we knew these folks really were going to need cooling. Wildfire smoke had just been a big issue, and we're like, we want to make sure air quality is there. So coupling energy savings with being able to provide all that kind of seasonal comfort with heat pumps and heat recovery ventilators, and with really good filtration, all of that worked out for the benefit of the resident and the health, which is what it all kind of comes back to from that equity perspective. Yeah, and there's certainly more lessons learned we can get into in the Q&A if need be. I don't want to go too much farther, but this is just some of the things. Definitely the solar approach was great, and a lot of these things worked well. There's a few things that we would iron out in the future, but they're kind of details, if you will. So happy to talk about that later.
Okay. Everyone here knows that the construction process is always challenging for any project, and although there's a perception of things being lower cost in rural areas, many other challenges arise in that environment. Can you speak to some of those specific challenges and the lessons the team learned through in moving through them?
Yes. Things are not cheaper in rural areas. Like some things are, but some things aren't. And it's really hard to tell the difference when you're going into a project. For us, that was especially true around Davis-Bacon wages. So in Union County, much of the labor we encountered was non-unionized. So the wage surveys that are put out by the Department of Labor were often incomplete. So the wage determinations that we would use to set the wages for the subcontracts would miss classifications that were critical for the project. For example, our project needed painters, and there wasn't a classification for painters in our wage determination. So we had to appeal to DOL, which takes time, and there's risk there. And to help you, combat that risk, Department of Labor recommended to us what they call the median -1 approach, which sort of divorces the price that folks are being paid for the work that they're doing and attaches it to what's some of the highest wages within the determination letter, and that's the rate that you pay, which which turned out great for a painter in LeGrand. For example, when we got the bids back for painters, the average of those bids hourly rate was around $27 an hour. For context, last I checked, the Boley rate for a commercial painter in Portland is around $47 an hour. And our wage determination came back for painters in LeGrand at $55 an hour. So a significant difference that we hadn't anticipated. And again, that's great for painters in LeGrand. That's the prevailing wage rate. That's what we're going to pay folks. But it's something that you want to get ahead of, because if we didn't anticipate some of those costs ahead of time. And so they made some harder decisions and choices that we had to make down the road. So if you're working in rural areas where a lot of the labor isn't union, we recommend really going in with a contractor that's really familiar with Davis-Bacon wages, or hiring a consultant that can come in and really help you navigate the process and look at your county's prevailing wage determination specifically and walk through and identify some of those risks ahead of time, so you can really budget that into the project, because those wages are great. I mean, my dad was a tradesperson, and he would travel across the state to work on prevailing wage jobs. So we really want to encourage those projects, but we just really need to plan for them and plan for those risks ahead of time.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up real quick to put you on the spot. When did you find out the wage rate for the painter? Like how late in the process? Because like at that point, if I'm correct, that was well into the start of construction that you're finally getting that information, right?
It was. We weren't able to apply for our project specific wage determination or modification request until after we'd signed our AHAP, Housing Assistance Programs. Someone probably knows the acronym in here, Dan. But until we had gotten that contract signed, and we couldn't get that contract signed until right before construction closing. To do that, we have to have our construction budget, pretty well ironed out. So, and that process took, 4 or 5 months. So yeah, we're well into construction. We're trying to estimate as best as we can. And then a number like that comes back and you're just like, and then we have to figure it out.
Yeah, and I'll just say a couple of quick things. I think, one, we avoided a ton of challenges by just having the team that we had and the level of collaboration and trust, which was awesome. I think that's huge, just being able to build that as early as possible. There was some really great local subs on the project. Everybody worked really hard to make sure that as many local subs as feasible could be engaged, that had the capacity to do the project. And we worked with a couple that were very communicative, and that worked great. Like they brought ideas to the table with the siding company. The landscape crew did this kind of really great native, they're willing to do the kind of native landscape plantings that nobody in the area really had experience with, but they also didn't know how to do it in the sort of kind of conventional way. So our landscape architect was out there with them, just on the ground, figuring it out. So it was, that part was really cool. And then of course there were some subs that needed to be brought in from urban areas just based on capacities and availability. So that was kind of an ongoing, mix, some of those decisions being made right down to the wire. I'm sure James remembers too. But yeah, just from the architect's perspective, I would say that, yeah, remote CA is a little bit tough. It was a lot of trips, and it just took even more than we kind of anticipated. So never underestimate that, and make the best use of tools and cameras and remote things that you can come up with together as a team. And Sarah would just say that normal is going to look different than you're used to. So it's different out here.
Understandable. Okay, as we've discussed today, this project was faced with some pretty big challenges, some of which would easily stop a project from happening, and not at all unlike the challenges that many other projects face regularly. With the need for affordable housing at a high, your perseverance to see this project to completion will certainly make a huge impact. What are some of the key strategies that you want folks here to be able to take with them as they develop, design, and/or build projects with similar goals and challenges? Even though their circumstances might be different than ours, what's something that was really like worth doing that we did here?
Pickleball. Seriously, everyone loves pickleball. I don't know what it is, but if it's a contentious project, just put pickleball in it, and I feel like you'll be all right. Okay, I don't know. That could be a toss-up.
When we started the project, the splash pad idea was like on everybody's talking about a splash pad. They wanted a splash pad in here. And we're like, but it snows so much and it's going to freeze. And what's that going to be like in the winter? And then it turned into pickleball. And now everybody wants the pickleball.
But seriously, I just say that this project was really complex. I jotted down a few of the things. There was the tenant paid utilities, the net solar production, underwriting the operating expenses with those renewable resources, high performance building requirements, changing tax credit law, new technology, grants, certification requirements. So it was all incredibly challenging, and it really did take a village of professionals and community members to come together. But at the end, it was really worth it. I think that it's our responsibility to provide high quality, vibrant, affordable housing everywhere. And, when I started on this project, I don't think I quite knew just how different the challenges would be developing in a rural area. The interstate closes during the winter, like consistently. It's just because of the weather, and it's the major interstate through, and so that's just something that I hadn't encountered before. And it impacts your delivery schedules, and you have to be flexible, and you have to work together to find really practical solutions to really novel problems. And but I really encourage everyone, if you see a rural project, not to let the complexity scare you away, because I'm really proud of the project that we have. And it feels really good to be at this point of it, almost to the end. Feels really good.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, yeah, that just kind of coming into a project like this, not from that beginner's mind, right? Of not just to rinse and repeat, but to really be thoughtful and purposeful about everything that we do, because that really matters. And that, kind of making sure that the residents' life is going to be supported, that they're going to be happy, and that the property manager and the service provider team are well equipped. Like if we can do those things, no matter what, whether there's community opposition or resistance to a project like this, which there was not in this case. LeGrand was extremely easy and supportive place to do this, but it's not always the case. So but if we can do those things, then the community definitely comes around, I think, to when they see people kind of moving in. And and just kind of getting excited about the place to live. And in this case, like, you know, I think Sarah was excited to just see, like, to have people come in and say, oh, this isn't just like, it's not just a complex. This does really feel like it's colorful. It feels like a home. It feels like there's things here. So that was really our goal, and that was all really worthwhile. It was, yeah, really worth sticking through all the challenges. Going out there for construction was, yeah, it was really great just to kind of to be in that other place, but feel part of it. So I think that was huge for us. And I'd say just kind of coming at it from that abundance mindset of like, let's just make everything possible if we can.
We also should plug LeGrand. Their jurisdiction is really great to work with. So if anybody needs to do a project in a rural community. Okay, we're gonna open up the floor to some Q&A, and I'll bring a mic around. I saw his hand for first. I'm gonna go this way and we'll go back.
Yeah, I just wondered, how do you factor diversity and equity into a program like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. One example was our goals around participation in the workforce. So we had our minimum goals with OHCS, and we targeted a 20% participation rate of contractors. And we were also trying to, have a goal of local participation. And what we found as we were going through the project was that we were having a hard time hitting our MWESB goals, which were a part of our DEI goals for the project. And we worked with OHCS and Claudia Cantu over there to try and understand, well, how could we look at this a little bit differently? We're working out in LeGrand where there isn't as much awareness and resources around COVID certification. We believe that a lot of these firms qualify, minority-owned, women-owned, emerging small business, but they're not in the state registry. We want to hire local. We want to bring the economic development to the community, and we also want to meet these participation goals. So we were able to do self-reporting, and we work with her to allow that. So we were really able to count and have those goals align instead of being opposed potentially. And now we are at 26% participation in a rural community, and we're proud of that.
I'll add just a little bit. Our design team, we kind of started the project with a really high percentage of minority and women-owned firms on the design side. Really proud about that. Partway through, we had to transition from design build mechanical to kind of design build, and there aren't a whole lot of minority firms in that world, but so that changed it a little bit, but it was still really great, and it's an effort we try to put in. And I'll also say that the asset-based engagement team, like, even though we didn't have time and opportunity in the way the project was set up to do kind of a community meeting and bring in those voices directly, that engagement team, as they were going out meeting with different organizations and trying to kind of follow the threads out through the community, were bringing as much feedback from everybody as they could. So we really did kind of make sure that we integrated as many of those things that came back through that process as we could.
Into that. When we were looking specifically with, racial equity, inclusion, and diversity, the populations of different minority groups in LeGrand was smaller, but we did see a similar mix of backgrounds and diversities represented in the community. So we really tried to, as Nate said, the asset-based community development process, really, we tried to bring folks in to that part. We also, though, had a lot of different funding sources. I think part of the different unit sizes and the Section 8 vouchers. And we also worked with Oregon Health Authority, and we were able to provide HOPWA vouchers to the site for folks living with AIDS, and to have an opportunity, a place to stay in rural community. So that was something else that we really tried to make the opportunities to live on site as inclusive as possible.
I was just hoping that you would expand a little bit on what made LeGrand so great to work with. Like, what were some of the things that the local jurisdiction did to facilitate the project?
Yeah, I'll say from the very early meeting, like the very first meetings we had with some of the city folks. I mean, I think a lot of it was because Dan and Sarah and Dale at the Housing Authority had all laid a lot of groundwork in the past. Everybody was really aware of this site and wanted it to be affordable housing. So there was kind of already this stance of, we have a need, we have a site that's zoned for it, it's just ready, we just need somebody to kind of run with it. So, I mean, that was great. It was like kind of already in the DNA. And then, you know, we met with the officials about planning and building codes and all that stuff. And it just was the easiest thing we've ever seen. And the process, like the permitting process, was extremely fast, very communicative. You know, you could email somebody and get something right back or pick up the phone. So that was really great. And I think the only sort of point of struggle we maybe had was their code requires carports in the parking lot, which added a cost. And we were like really wanting to lose that cost to prioritize other things. And that was just one that, even though folks understood it, there was a lot of you know, willingness, but the political powers that be wouldn't really allow that one to shift. But I think that was probably the biggest struggle that we had.
Yeah, and I would add, a lot of jurisdictions, it seems like you kind of go in with a project as an architect, you submit your project and they're like, yeah, that's great, but no, you got to do all these other things. Whereas like when we submitted the project to the LeGrand, they're like, yes, this is awesome. Let me figure out how to help you get this through. And so just the attitude, like the tone of all the conversations was super positive. Their attitude was super positive. And as Nate said, they had done a housing kind of needs analysis. They knew that they wanted the housing there. The groundwork was laid. They were very excited to have us bring this project forward and help make it happen. And like you said, the only thing that we ran into was carports was the only trouble. But yeah.
This is similar to Kami's question, but I am wondering, did you guys have to meet with like ODOT or anything because you were developing in a rural location? I've had a couple projects that have come in and they're like, hey, we have a problem with ODOT now. And I just want to see if that's something that you guys had to deal with.
Not ODOT specifically. We weren't on any highways directly. I think we had some of the HUD requirements of being close to the freeway. So we had some noise things, air quality things to work through, just to meet those processes.
Yeah. I mean, not HUD specifically, but we did have some larger, like federal issues that came up from highway noise and mitigating that and other things. Yeah.
One of the things that really intrigued me about this project is the inclusion of the daycare center. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how the funding for that specifically affected the pro forma.
Yeah. So, and this is really Dan's brainchild. So hopefully I get it right. If I don't, correct me later. But really, it was great to find a partner that was willing to come on site and provide services. And all we had to do was build the space. You know, fortunately, that's what we do. And then that's what they do. So it was a pretty natural fit. We had to figure out how we were going to pay for that. You know, we were planning on having a fairly robust community center anyway. So, you know, it's not a commercial space. There's not any income generated from there. You know, they're a grant funded program. They provide free daycare. So it really was just about providing them the space and just including that in the budget early on. Our partner, Eastern Oregon, University Head Start was also incredible partners. They're like the most enthusiastic partner you will ever have. They show up, like everyone shows up to everything, and they wear matching t-shirts, and they're just so pumped up about everything. Robert Klang, their executive director, is amazing. And they actually ended up being one of the people on the working group and also a grant funder. So they raised almost close to $100,000 to put towards the playground. So they helped in that way as well.
When it came to the trauma-informed design, was that always part of the discussion? And then was there a price did you notice a difference in cost when building it, trauma-informed design?
That's a good question. I think like we were saying, it wasn't like a clear mandate of like, we're doing trauma-informed design and it has to look this way. It was more like, how do we meet those particular needs in the best way possible? And so I would say that most of the things we did had multiple benefits, right? So it's a little hard to put them in one bucket of cost and impact. I mean, I think some of the features that the buildings have did increase their cost a bit. And even with all the very difficult cost challenges, some of those features managed to really stay. And I think that's because they were doing more than one thing, right? And they added a sense of identity and value that couldn't be replaced. And I think, not to speak for Sarah, but I think that her perspective was just like, those things are just really, really important. It's really important to the community, how people feel in the space. And so for us, it was just a matter of, to make sure that it was trauma informed. We just wanted to make sure those materials and things came together in a way that fit that framework and that way of understanding, but we were able to really just kind of follow some of the best practices in terms of color and lighting and some of those things, and then kind of try to build those kind of deeper meaning and sort of visual identities with those porches that really became prominent to the design.
So I'll put a little plug in for Inkbuilt here. There were competing priorities. There's durability, there's trauma-informed design, and working with an architect whose values just naturally align with a lot of these ideas and principles like trauma-informed design. It really integrated seamlessly, from my perspective, into the design process. So when we're looking at materials, when we're talking about how we want things to look and function and, the resident experience, it was all really well integrated. And, we're talking about durability and trauma-informed design and accessibility and looking at those options together. And it was a pretty seamless process.
I'll add to that a little bit. I would say it definitely probably added a little bit of cost because, as I mentioned, some of the decisions that we made going from a single loaded corridor or a double loaded corridor to a single loaded corridor inherently makes more building envelope, right? And so there are things that would potentially drive cost, but there were also mechanisms specific to this site where it's a pretty large site. You're capped at 35 feet tall. We could cram all those buildings together real tight, make it a little bit less livable and leave more open space, off to the side. But that livability became so important that I don't know that you can put a price to that, right? So I'm sure, yes, from a construction budget, we could have made the buildings a little bit cheaper. We could have done modular. We could have done a little bit from the very beginning to like cram them tighter, made the units even a little bit smaller, not done 4-bedroom units, but we were going for family sized units. We were going for a real community-based approach. And so it actually was the language that we used most early on in design was more about being safe and community-centered and less even trauma-informed, but they're kind of the same thing. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for your time today.